My name is Ann Reed. I am a co-president of the Darien League of Women Voters along with Julie Hill, who is sitting right here. And we are delighted to welcome the Secretary of the State of Connecticut, Stephanie Thomas, to come talk to us about a topic that is very timely right now, early voting in the state of Connecticut. Stephanie Thomas has spent her entire career in public service. Prior to her election as Secretary of the State, she served as state representative of Connecticut's 143rd District, Norwalk, Wilton, and Westport. As vice chair of the Government Administration and Elections Committee, Stephanie sponsored and helped pass a variety of voter-focused bills, such as automatic voter registration and resolutions to advance early voting and universal access to absentee ballots. Stephanie is committed to protecting voting rights and strengthening civic education in Connecticut. Stephanie joined the public sector after a distinguished 30-year career advising and problem solving for nonprofit organizations. She has worked as a strategy and fundraising consultant since 1996 and opened her own fundraising consulting firm in 2013, raising more than $20 million annually for organizations working to help those left behind. Stephanie holds a BA from New York University and an MS in nonprofit management from the New School. Throughout her career, Stephanie has served on many boards, strategic planning committees, and as an active volunteer in her community. She and her husband reside in Norwalk, Connecticut. And now would you give a warm welcome to the Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas.
Thank you, and thank you to the League for having me. Thank you, so many familiar faces in the audience. I'm just happy not to be on the campaign trail. I love the League of Women Voters because I think we're unified in this quest that I have about civic education and civic participation. Most recently, I was talking to a group and we were saying civic literacy, financial literacy, why don't they teach these things in school? Like, these are lifelong skills that would serve us in good stead. So before I get into early voting, which is pretty much the only topic I've been talking about since December 2021, many of you met Ariana Roscoe, one of my colleagues. When I got to the Secretary's office, I created a new job, Director of Outreach and Engagement. And Ariana's goal, our goal this year, is to do everything possible, everything different. We'll be speaking at the League convention about some of the things that have worked, that haven't worked. We've been doing family civic trivia nights at libraries for ages 7 and up. The Boys and Girls Club is rolling it out at all of their locations soon. We've been putting together educational events to teach seniors and people with disabilities voting rights with regard to, voting by listening to the ballot. And, there's so many people who don't know these things. We've been trying to get funding, private funding for someone to finance a project that the Wilton League did, where they put together an outline of how government works in Wilton, what positions are elected, which are appointed, how long the term is, what that job does. And we thought, wouldn't this be great if this existed in every town? The League is not in every town, so we're like, oh, someone should finance this. So we are going around meeting with anyone who will have us, looking for collaborations, looking for ways. My goal would be to have 100% voter participation and at least 80% participation the rest of the year. So I throw out to everyone, if you have any good ideas, new ideas, be in touch with Ariane. She's here, she has business cards. This year in particular, we're just seeing how we can move the needle. So speaking of moving the needle, early voting, definitely something, it's part of the reason I got into politics to begin with. It felt like a very common sense reform. I didn't know why Connecticut didn't have it. I saw that the person who served as the 143rd rep before me had voted against it several times in the legislature. So I decided I need to go to Hartford to figure out why people are voting against it. So it's something that has been near and dear to my heart. And as we saw last November, just over 60% of voters said, yes, we want early voting. So then the hard part began. So ever since the election, I've been going around meeting with every conceivable stakeholder because my goal was to get on the same page by January, because I knew that once the legislative session starts, people only have 2 weeks after the beginning of session to submit bills. And like everybody else, I was seeing headlines like, let's have 45 days of early voting. And I'm like, no, let's have 30 days, 18 days, And I was at an event earlier today, a poll worker appreciation event, which is another program we just started. Today was the first one. And someone was asking me about, my opinion about where the bill is. And I had to remind myself, and I'll throw this out as a caveat, it's so easy to say the system isn't working when we don't get our way. And I felt the same way, but I had to, literally, I woke up this morning and I said, oh wait, that is the system. This is a representative democracy, and people get to weigh in, and whoever has the most voices usually wins. So I say that to say, the day I took office, my first meeting was at 4 p.m. that day of the inauguration with one of the chairs of the Government Administration and Elections Committee. And the next day, I had a meeting with the governor. And people may recall there were a lot of news articles at that time. There were people who were really committed to 30 days of early voting, and there were some people really committed to 1 day. And with all the sausage making, and I remind everybody, I don't actually get a vote. I just try to use whatever political capital I have to be heard. It helps that I was vice chair of the Government Administrations and Elections Committee, so I think I had built up some credibility. I knew the players, and they knew that I was generally a thoughtful person, that I read all the bills, that I asked good questions. So I think that has stood me in good stead. So where things were ending up, you may recall, there were 3 bills that the committee called: a 10-day bill, a 14-day bill, an 18-day bill. The main difference, other than the number of days, some of them included special elections. One of them included special elections and town referenda. And my bill, the one that our office was sort of behind promoting, was the 10-day bill that did not include specials or referenda, just primaries and generals. So the elections committee, they raised all 3 bills. They had a public hearing. I was a little bit upset because only about 65 people showed up to testify, although a couple of hundred wrote letters. But we got a lot of good feedback, in particular from registrars and town clerks, and some election industry insider types who know a lot about how elections work. So the committee went back, took all that feedback, we gave them feedback, and they ended up passing 3 bills out of committee. And I'll try to outline the bill. So the ones they passed out of the committee, 1 called for 10 days of early voting, 2 called for 14 days. One of them still included referenda. All of them were almost identical in everything else. So 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. for 10 days or 14 days, concluding the Sunday before Election Day. 2 days during that window would be 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. after the public hearing, the committee added a provision for any towns above 20,000 could opt into a second location, because all the bills call for one location per town. And in case people don't know, what I'll call a manual method of voting. So not a tabulator, more like election day registration almost, where you come, you check in, they check to make sure you haven't voted, you fill out your ballot, you put it in an envelope, it's sealed, it goes into secure storage, and it's opened on election day. So that's how it will work. So that is true in all bills. I've been trying to get them to write out a piece. I'm not sure if it'll survive or not. So for those towns who want to opt into a second location, or who don't, so any town above 20,000, the way it's written now, if they don't want a second location, the town's administrative body has to call a public hearing that is noticed. People get to give their feedback, and then they have to send a justification to my office about why they're not having a second location. That felt very clunky to us, and they gave us no standard by which to judge. Like, okay, so now what I understand, the latest version, I have not seen it yet, will make it permissive to have that second location. And if they do have to send a justification, it's just for the log in case someone ever says, how come Darien didn't have a second location? Like, we would have a copy of that letter. I don't know what the final bill is going to look like, but I've been trying to get them to take that out. Referenda, I think, will come out because most people understand a lot of town budget referendums. You know, there's all these automatic triggers. If you vote on something and it fails, 2 days later you vote again. And I'm like, how do we have early voting during that? The latest versions all call for special elections, but they will have 4 days of early voting, not 10. What else? And there's a lot of little things in there. Our office will take more responsibility for recruiting and training poll workers. Our office would put together the public education campaign, or obviously hire vendors to make sure people are educated around what it is, isn't, how it works. The other thing I try to explain to people, most people have the experience of election day for voting, or they've lived in another state, which is organized very differently than Connecticut. So I think it's helpful to talk about how early voting is different than election day voting. Election day voting, we've all seen all the various roles. There's like a checker, that's the person who like looks you up, they cross you off on the list, all of that. There is a tabulator tender, that's the person that removes all the paper jams when you feed your ballot in. And there's all these, there's about 6 or 7, someone tell me, 6 or 7 different jobs on election day. For early voting, the main difference is every registrar in Connecticut works on election day. What most people don't realize is Connecticut only has about 17 towns that have full-time registrars of our 169 towns. Most are very part-time. Many are by appointment only. Some work 1 day a week, a couple hours a day. Every town is different. So registrars will not be working every day of the early voting period. So the way the bills are currently written, registrars, deputy registrars are much like we see on election day. Moderators will be able to run the polling place, wherever your early voting location is. But that's a big difference. We have try to make sure towns have flexibility. We did not put in a minimum number of staff because we wanted to make sure towns could have like just a couple of people, because if you're in Union with 800 people, not even 800 voters, 800 people, that's going to be different than Stamford. So we wanted to give towns the flexibility, and also the flexibility if on the first day they get flooded, like they can add people. I'm trying to think what else. So those are the main differences. I'm trying to think if there's anything else helpful, and then I can answer questions. Am I forgetting anything? The other main thing, once we have final language, our office will be writing the regulations. So that is, your early voting location needs to be ADA accessible. It needs to have a parking lot. It needs to, what does it have to have? How do you organize it? We will be helping the towns figure out, coming up with some sort of formula based on no data, about like how many staff might make sense per voters. Walking through the process of how ballot security, chain of custody, all of that will be written, given to the towns as a template, and then the town election, our registrars will make any adjustments they need for their town, and then send that back for our approval. And all of this will happen months before the election. Oh, I forgot it. I buried the lead. Yeah, I buried the lead. If anyone has read any news outlet in the last 3 days, I think you've heard this will not happen in 2023. So I should talk about that a little bit, because I've been sort of misquoted, and some headlines I think are more splashy than the situation deserves. Most people recall when I took office, I said we have to pass a bill by March 31st to have early voting for the November 2023 election. So to their credit, the Government Administrations and Elections Committee, they took me to heart. By the second week in January, they were like, let's talk. We had many meetings in January and February to help get the bill to a place for the public hearing. They got it through committee. They passed it out of committee very quickly. At the same time, we were trying to meet with leadership in the House and the Senate to say, okay, once it's out of committee, you need to call it quickly. I knew March 31st would never work, but in my mind, I was like mid-April, and we had some commitments that they would call it early. So meanwhile, so that's the legislative side, which is outside of my control. What I do have to control is the implementation side. So meanwhile, my IT department, and my chief of staff and, people at SOTS, we were trying to figure out the implementation. So, for example, we started writing the regulations the second week of January. We had no idea what a bill would look like, but I'm like, let's just start drafting something so that we're ahead of the curve if we have to move forward. I assume 2023. We started putting together a poll worker recruitment program the third week in January, again, trying to get ahead of the curve. So now I'm going to get into the weeds. We have something called CVRS. Does everyone know what CVRS is? Okay, it's the Centralized Voter Registration System. So, like, if you've ever been to a polling place and they look up someone and it has a little A next to their name, that means they voted by absentee ballot. Or if you've ever tracked your absentee ballot online to see if it was received, all of this magic happens through CVRS. It's how we know how, and not how you voted, what you voted, but the method by which absentee ballot are on election day. We know that you've already voted. Many of you have volunteered on campaigns, and you know you can get that list of people who have requested absentee ballots but have not yet returned them. All of this happens through CVRS. So to add early voting, we have to add a module that would allow us to track if someone had already voted early. And on paper, that seemed really simple to me. I'm like, oh, we already add an A, we can just add an E. I was naive. So let's go back in history, back in time. Connecticut was one of the first states in the country to have this centralized voter registration system. But that also means it's very old. Much like our tabulators, the company that built it no longer exists. So you might say, Stephanie, this sounds like a really important system. How are you maintaining it now? Well, let me tell you, we have found former employees of this company that we hired to do the maintenance, and they've been very great, and they've done it. But fast forward, another company sort of bought out that other company, and this new company owns our source code for our database, which means we can't change it unless they change it. So while I was having all these great conversations with the legislature and the leadership, where my IT is having conversations with this third-party vendor. And the hardest decision I've had to make so far was, how much do I trust them? So I do what we all do when we hire a contractor. You look at their body of work, you have a meeting, you get references. And best case scenario for them was they could get it done by October. In case you don't know, elections are in November. November 7th to be exact. And they were like, we can probably hit October 1st, but we'd rather not take on the project at all. I'm like, that doesn't sound good. So, a lot of meetings, a lot of gut checks, a lot of Stephanie calling secretaries across the country who had worked with this company, asking them about their experience, and I decided it's a no-go. I had no confidence that it would be finished on time, through no fault of their own, right? A lot of it is, this is like an old body of work that they picked up. It's not their mainline business. Like everybody, they're having labor issues. It just felt like too many issues, and I did not want it to go wrong. So, and just in case I didn't make this clear, we need this module to know if someone voted more than once. So it's very critical to the operation of early voting. I went to the legislature and I'm like, I don't think we can get it off the ground. So a lot of people are like, well, they're calling it so late, that's why. And I'm like, no, but they stopped the rush once they got that assessment from me. So I'm trying to be fair, not like throw them under the bus in any way, because it wasn't them. So that's where we are. So my plan is 2024. A lot of us wanted it in 2023, more just to have a test run at a time that wasn't a presidential election. We should still be able to do a test run in for the primary, the August primary in 2024. So I think that's okay. It gives us more time to recruit poll workers. It gives us more time for me to go around and give this speech like 800 more times. Well, we're filming it. Maybe I'll just send this video. Sometimes I'm like, I've been talking about this for so long. It just gives us more time. And so for anyone who's worried about this old company who owns our source code, the reason 2024 works is that for the last year or so under Secretary Merrill, we knew we needed a new CVRS system. So all of that was in process. I got to be the secretary who actually signed the contract. So that project has already started. So we'll have a new sort of best in class. We will own the source code, so we never have this conversation again 17 years from now. So that project is underway and due to be done, completed in June of next year. So I think that gives us more time. I'm certainly more comfortable. So that's where we are with early voting.
Good.